As we've been discussing, the IMF World meetings are happening right now, and the Boao Forum in China have been taking place all this week. Both events include top government officials, business leaders, and of course, a lot of journalists. And we thought this would be a good opportunity to turn the cameras on the media, especially on how specifically Western media covers the world's second largest economy. Here's a couple of recent headlines that's been making the headlines. CNN says China's economy is losing steam. The New York Times asks about China's coming economic crisis, and the Wall Street Journal calls it China's new low in growth. Well, that would obviously worry viewers. Meanwhile, China's planning growth is still above 7% this year. It will be one of the fastest growing countries still in the world. So we decided to sit down with a trio of top journalists to discuss the ins and outs of covering China's economy. Matt Pennington of the Associated Press, correspondent on U.S. Asian affairs, Chris Nelson, editor-in-chief of the Nelson Report, and Doug Palmer, trade reporter with Politico. I asked Matt if there is a us versus them mentality in the U.S.
I think that some in the United States consider China to be a threat, and you often hear those opinions voiced on Capitol Hill. Within the administration, I think less so. They see it as a relationship with competition, but also cooperation. And they seek to accentuate the cooperation while dealing with the competitive parts of the relationship. And I think at the moment we're seeing more friction, which is presenting more challenges in managing that relationship.
Doug, this is not the first time Americans have felt perhaps a little heat from competition. We felt that way in some part with Mexico and also Japan as well. And I wonder, in your view, is there another strategy that perhaps either government can take to mitigate some of those risks?
I don't know. I think the answer is just more engagement, more dialogue, and building bridges to understand the other country better. I mean, a lot of the concern generates in Congress, and much of it comes from the trade figures that they see every month, the deficit between the United States and China rising every year, and a lot of concern or the perception that U.S. businesses are being shut out of that market and don't have the access that they have. So perhaps more engagement, China moving forward on economic reforms to open up its market a bit more might help the situation.
Chris, you've been covering this a very long time.
You know, forever, it seems like.
Well, let's not say forever, but there are a lot of similarities in how the U.S. is viewed when we look at different countries around the world who have not opposed the U.S. necessarily, but have had to deal on a trading relationship with the U.S., and that causes anxiety, doesn't it?
Yes. We spent most of the 90s kind of getting geared up to get China into the WTO. So you had American business very excited about China. It was the coming thing. The Deng Xiaoping reforms were really starting to kick in. So the coverage was in some ways inherently positive because it was about opportunity. Once China got into the WTO, there were a period of years where I think things remained basically positive and the attitudes were basically positive because it was still China's coming online now, oh boy, look. But inevitably, once you get really deeply involved in someone else's economy and someone else's society, then the obvious difficulties and practical things start to come up. And as journalists, our job is to write about what is difficult or what is interesting or what isn't quite working out the way we were told or the way the business guys may have hoped, so that you get, I think, especially if you're in China, probably an impression that the American press and the foreign press is anti-China. And I don't think that's how any of us see what we're doing. What we think we're doing is accurately reporting, we hope, on the sort of rising awareness or concerns of both the government and the business community about the practical issues that come up that have to be resolved. The basic attitude still remains, I think, to carry out Robert Zoellick's stakeholder speech of now 10 years ago. It's hard to believe. The idea was to work with China, cooperate with China, bring China into the world community. Yes, it's a largely Western community. Yes, we did make the rules. And that's where some of the conflict, I think, now is coming up.
You're definitely dating yourself if you're talking about the WTO in 1999. But I want to get Doug and Matt's view on this, and maybe we can segue into sort of the way media has changed and the way they've covered China over the past 10 or 15 years or so. And I guess let's start with Matt. What do you see as the greatest challenge for someone like yourself who, who's covering these topics? Some of them can be very controversial. What's the toughest part of that?
Well, to be honest, I don't think that I face the greatest challenges because I'm not reporting in China. I think in Washington we're quite lucky in that we get good access to administration officials and people in Congress who have lots of very fervent opinions. We also have a lot of think tankers who can help us sort of analyze what's going on. I think for my colleagues in China, they still have problems on getting access to officials to find out Chinese thinking. And I think we have some access in Washington to Chinese officials, and they can be helpful. But there is a sense that you get a lot of information from one side, but perhaps not so much from the other than information from state outlets.
Without putting you on the spot, how do your colleagues, I guess, handle those challenges?
Well, I think they work within the parameters that they have to work within. I think over the past 10 years, there has been actually a very significant change in how reporters can do their job in China. There has been an opening up. And I think also the social media has made it easier in some ways to access the views of Chinese people. And also there's more ability to travel around China as well.
The United States as a whole, from a federal government standpoint, they have been critical of China, not anti-China, critical of China on many different levels. And I bring that up because on the state level, you see governors of various states more than welcome Chinese businesses into the United States, and we have seen an increase, nonetheless, of investment in the United States by China. And I'm wondering, is this a mixed message? And, for our audience around the world, obviously in China as well, help them understand why there is this sort of mixed message. And if I'm a company in China and I'm watching this right now, am I more encouraged to invest in U.S. or am I perhaps more confused, Matt?
I think that I think the administration, the Obama administration, would welcome Chinese investment into the U.S. I mean, some investment projects which they think pertain to national security may have to go through a review. But at a time when capital is short in the U.S., that's one thing that China has. And there have been success stories in China. And we've seen a sharp spike in Chinese investment in the U.S. over the last 2 or 3 years, admittedly from a low level, but it is increasing. And I think there is a sort of mixed message, you're correct, and I think it's partly derived from suspicions about the migration of manufacturing jobs to China from the United States. And I think this sort of feeds into a narrative that China's economic growth is bad for America, bad for American jobs. But maybe in the years ahead, we may see that Chinese investment becomes an important source of jobs in the U.S.
Yeah. Matt's absolutely right about that. And I think you put your finger on an inherent sense of contradiction because American governors for the last, well, really, probably since the 1930s, have quite cheerfully recruited companies and industries from other American states with tax incentives and free land and promise of better drinking water or whatever it is. We saw this debate very strongly carried out in the 1980s when the Japanese were beginning what we now call the transplant movement, where Toyota and Hitachi and all those manufacturing companies built enormous plants in the United States. And I think that China has yet to exploit is not the right word because it has negative connotations, but China has yet to make that level of move yet. And as Matt said, there is the national security element, the so-called CFIUS review. And I think where it remains complicated for China is we are still working out with China how to think about and deal with the so-called SOEs, the state-owned industries, and those that have direct tie-ins to the PLA. And that gets us into the strategic realm that we're not talking about, but you can't avoid it when you're talking about congressional attitudes. I think if you could find me an American governor who gives a damn about any of that, I would be surprised. They are like any Chinese provincial governor. They need the jobs. Bring them on, baby. And that's how they're looking at it.
Doug, you have the last word to our global audience about the partly contradiction, but also the welcoming from states as well. Explain to our audience why they should come to the United States.
Why Chinese investors should come to the United States? Well, I mean, that's
given this confusing sort of background we just gave.
It'll give him something to write about. There's a good answer.
Yeah, I mean, that's a decision for Chinese companies to make. But I think that my colleagues are right in that the administration is certainly welcoming of investment and sees it as a source of job creation and economic growth. I mean, there's always going to be more suspicion in Congress, I think, than in the administration. That's just the nature of the beast, and the governors are always going to be more supportive. And part of the reason it might be confusing is because the national media is centered in Washington, and it reports more on what Congress is saying than on what the state governors are saying. So maybe that sort of distorts the view a bit. But, you know, I mean, we keep hearing that there's this wave of Chinese investment coming, and if it does come, it'll be interesting to see how the U.S. government reacts to that.
Gentlemen, thank you. A term that I learned during my time here, inside the Beltway. I think we've done some of that, but we've also tried to get outside of that as well. Doug Palmer, Politico, thank you. Chris Nelson, Editor-in-Chief of the Nelson Report, thank you. Matt Pennington, Associated Press, U.S. Asian Affairs, thank you again. Excellent discussion. That does it for me. Much more to come on Biz Asia America.